This incident occurred a few years ago, yet it continues to evoke an unsettling sensation whenever I reflect on it. I am discussing it now because I believe sufficient time has passed since the event, and I do not perceive any risk in sharing it online. At that time, my wife and I we recently relocated from the city to the suburbs after the birth of our third child. The accumulation of baby items, toys, and general disorder rendered our apartment excessively confined. We discovered a charming house in a tranquil and secure neighborhood, where neighbors assured us it was a place suitable for leaving doors unlocked. Although the house was not expansive, it represented a significant improvement over our previous limited living space. One feature that particularly captivated my wife was the backyard, which boasted a lovely, slightly overgrown garden. Several antiquated statues were dispersed throughout the yard, exhibiting weathered and somewhat eerie appearances reminiscent of elements from Game of Thrones. Although it may seem peculiar, my wife and I appreciated their presence, believing they added character to our yard. I remained largely indifferent and chose to leave everything, including the statues, undisturbed, reasoning that it would require less effort on my part, a fact for which I was grateful. A few days after our relocation, while gazing out the window to admire the yard, I observed an unusual detail. One of the statues, an angel, was oriented away from the house, unlike the others. Initially oriented toward us, the statue appeared peculiar. I could have sworn they all faced the same direction, yet I lacked certainty. I dismissed it as a misrecollection. The following morning, upon gazing out the window, I observed that another statue had rotated, now facing away from the house. At that moment, I was unequivocally convinced that something was amiss. I inquired with my wife, but she merely shrugged it off, claiming she had not observed anything unusual. I suspected my son Timmy, who was a mischievous child, might be responsible. However, when I inquired, he regarded me as if I were irrational. I doubted he would engage in such behavior, yet I sensed something amiss without concrete evidence. I opted not to escalate the situation, as I had more pressing concerns. Reluctantly, I acknowledged that my financial situation was precarious, and I lived in constant apprehension of job loss. Several days passed without incident. The tea was peculiar, and I began to unwind. However, one evening, I gazed out the window, and my heart nearly ceased. All the statues were arranged in a row at the edge of the house, standing ominously. It was a grotesque sight, reminiscent of a horror film. Although it may seem absurd, I could sense the multitude of eyes fixated on me, causing my breathing to become shallow. I was torn between whether it was more frightening or bizarre. I ventured outside for a closer inspection, attempting to comprehend the situation before opening the back door. Apprehensive glances around the yard confirmed my suspicion of solitude. Despite the daylight, I felt paranoid. Eventually, I summoned the courage to open the door and examine the statues. Upon attempting to lift one, I quickly recognized that these statues were excessively heavy for a single individual to maneuver. I could not even shift one of them independently. While contemplating my next move, my wife emerged outside, and her expression indicated that she was equally unsettled. She proposed that perhaps some of the others. The neighbors were attempting to intimidate the newcomers on the block, but that rationale was utterly illogical. We had interacted with all the neighbors, and they appeared to be relatively normal individuals. Furthermore, I found it difficult to believe that any rational person would engage in such behavior towards a family with young children. This constituted harassment, not a mere prank. We ultimately contacted the police. However, as anticipated, their response was limited. They recommended installing security cameras, but we lacked the financial means for that, as I informed the officers. Although we considered it, I was internally hesitant to undertake such a drastic action. They departed, and I felt somewhat relieved, despite my wife remaining profoundly unsettled. My wife and I endeavored to conceal the situation from our children. Regardless of opinions, we aimed to avoid frightening them. No incidents occurred the following day or thereafter. I surmised that the police had intimidated the individuals present, which seemed plausible on various levels. Consequently, we attempted to dismiss the matter. Even though neither of us felt entirely at ease, I reassured myself that perhaps my wife was correct. It might have merely been a prank. However, this did little to alleviate my anxiety, as I remained on high alert, glancing out the windows whenever I walked by, half expecting to see the statue relocated. I hope no one ever endures the unsettling feeling of insecurity within their own residence. After a few days without incident, I began to believe the nightmare had concluded, and for the first time in a considerable while, the house was genuinely starting to feel like home. I could not have been more mistaken. It was a During the weekend, I cannot recall whether it was Saturday or Sunday, but it was undoubtedly a weekend as my children were not attending school. After breakfast, I ventured outside to play in the yard with my children, at which point I noticed the words "Go Away" spray painted in large black letters on the back wall of our house. I nearly dropped my son upon seeing it. Without hesitation, I hurried my children inside and instructed my wife to remain indoors with them. I am not typically a courageous individual, yet I began sprinting through the garden, shouted threats at the individual who had vandalized my house, adrenaline surging through my veins as I sought confrontation. However, no one was present in my yard. Eventually, I ceased my search, and as I walked back toward the house, the adrenaline transformed into sheer fear. This was a grave matter. Someone had left a direct message intended to intimidate us, and they could potentially inflict harm. I recognized that the situation was poised to escalate. The police arrived once more and filed another report, but without any leads. Their options were limited, urged them to remain on the premises in case those individuals returned, but they informed me that they lacked sufficient evidence to justify allocating resources in that manner. They suggested that it could merely be the work of some teenage delinquents. I was incredulous at their response. They assured me that a patrol officer would be in proximity, which I suppose was a form of consolation. My wife was even more distressed than I was, so I attempted to reassure her that we would be fine, despite my internal turmoil that night. While in the kitchen, I heard my wife scream from the living room. I rushed in to find her standing by the window, pointing outside. Upon looking, my stomach sank. 5 individuals were in our backyard, each adorned with white face coverings, dancing in an unsettling, jerky manner reminiscent of puppetry. We stood frozen, paralyzed by shock, as the scene unfolded before us. It was profoundly disturbing, and I could not comprehend their intentions. I eventually broke free from my stupor and seized the largest kitchen knife we possessed. Prompted me to urgently instruct my wife to contact the authorities. While she complied, I exited through the back door, brandishing the knife and screaming like a deranged individual. I advanced a single step toward them before immediately reconsidering. There were 5 assailants and only one of me, and they could potentially be armed. Before any further escalation occurred, I retreated into the house, feeling cowardly. However, the sight of the knife seemed to intimidate them, as they ceased their antics and fled into the garden, out of view. I then directed my wife to ascend the stairs. I located the children and concealed myself while I secured the rear entrance to prevent any potential intrusions. By the time law enforcement arrived, the perpetrators had vanished. The police conducted an exhaustive search but found no evidence of their presence. This incident was the final straw. I disregarded the expense and purchased and installed security cameras the following day. My wife was in a state of hysteria for weeks, pleading for us to relocate. I assured her that if another incident occurred, we would consider moving, although it would likely jeopardize our financial stability. Fortunately, the cameras evidently proved effective, as those individuals never returned, and no further incidents transpired on the property. The most unsettling aspect, however, is that we continue to reside in the same house without any clarification regarding the events that transpired. My wife, Sarah, and I recently vacated our former residence. She preferred to distance herself from her family, prompting our relocation. As we do not have children and she ceased working some time ago, she was relatively receptive to my proposals regarding our new home. As an electrician, frequent movement is not an issue for me. We ultimately chose New Mexico, as we have both lived in rural areas throughout our lives, making the transition relatively seamless. This decision was made approximately 3 months ago. We discovered an exceptional opportunity for a residence situated in the countryside. The house is, in fact, larger than necessary, particularly since it is just the 2 of us and our black lab, Lola. However, we anticipated utilizing the additional space, potentially hosting friends we would meet. We have been settled in for a short while. Several months ago, I began to observe an unusual occurrence. The upstairs lights repeatedly tripped circuits, while the remainder of the house maintained power. After this transpired once or twice, I immediately identified the issue. As a trained electrician, such matters are within my expertise. I anticipated a straightforward resolution, likely involving a redistribution of the load on the breaker located downstairs. Instances like these reinforce my appreciation for my ability to resolve technical problems. To be candid, I had not devoted significant time to the basement since our relocation. I lacked a compelling reason to do so. We had only conducted a cursory examination during the realtor's tour, and I did not focus on it. Reflecting on it, I realized I had not entered that space even once since then. As I descended the stairs, I began searching for the main breaker. The basement was rather disorganized and certainly not conducive to practical use. It resembled more of a storage area than a functional basement. Eventually, I located the breaker. After approximately 10 minutes of fussing, I identified the source of the load imbalance and resolved to rewire it when time permitted. Just as I was about to ascend the stairs, curiosity compelled me to explore the basement further. Given that this is my residence, it seemed peculiar that I was not intimately familiar with every corner of it. The space was predominantly occupied by antiquated furniture and various items of little value, yet there was nothing of particular interest, particularly intriguing in that location. I ultimately determined that converting it into a functional area would be excessively burdensome. It was then that I observed an unusual feature in the distant corner of the basement, concealed behind a pile of antiquated wooden chairs, a substantial metal door. This was no ordinary door. It appeared to be of industrial caliber, significantly taller than standard doors, and notably robust. Approaching it, my suspicions were validated. It resembled the kind of door typically employed to secure a. Upon encountering a walk-in safe or a panic room, my initial assumption was that it served as a tornado shelter or storm room. However, such a revelation would be an unexpected oversight by the realtor, who should have disclosed such a feature. I attempted to open the door, but the handle was immovable due to being locked. Consequently, I ascended the stairs and began sifting through the assortment of keys left by the previous owner for emergencies, yet none proved effective for this door. I must have tried approximately 15 keys, but to no avail. Fortunately, I eventually informed Sarah about the matter, and she exhibited equal curiosity. I remain uncertain how, but she employed her skills, enabling us to establish contact with the previous owners. That particular phone call transitioned my curiosity into genuine concern. They exhibited peculiar behavior, pausing intermittently as if contemplating their words or deliberately withholding information. A part of me regrets not recording the conversation, but hindsight is always clearer. In 2020, when I inquired about the door, they fell silent. Eventually, the wife explained it was merely a safe room for tornadoes. I acknowledged this but noted we could not access it as it was locked. After a brief pause, she asserted they had lost the key and instructed us to disregard it. I found this highly improbable, considering they had provided us with keys to various inconsequential doors. Her manner of speaking instilled a profound sense of unease in me, yet I felt powerless to act. Ultimately, we concluded the conversation immediately thereafter, as they were clearly not attempting to engage in casual conversation. Sarah attempted to dismiss the situation with laughter, asserting that I was overanalyzing it. However, I could not relinquish my thoughts. Over the subsequent weeks, I occasionally descended the stairs to gaze at that door, pondering its contents. I employed various methods to unlock it, including techniques I had acquired at work, but to no avail. The lock remained impenetrable. Ultimately, I ceased my efforts for approximately a week, yet my curiosity prevailed. Fast forward to 2 days ago when events took an unexpected turn following my wife's requests. I opted to engage a locksmith, who arrived and commenced his work. After approximately 30 minutes, I descended to assess his progress. He informed me that the lock was unusually intricate for a mere panic room, his exact phrasing. I was apprehensive about his ability to unlock it. However, to my astonishment, he successfully opened it after an additional 30 minutes. I regretted this outcome, as the interior resembled a shrine, adorned with vintage black and white photographs on the walls. Adorned with unfamiliar symbols, the chair in the center faced the wall, suggesting prolonged use by an individual who had been staring vacantly. In one corner, a cot lay with rumpled blankets, exuding a stale and unpleasant odor. Upon further inspection, I discovered discarded items, empty chip bags and crumpled water bottles. The stark realization struck me: someone had indeed been residing there, and not long ago. I was astounded. I had not anticipated the situation could deteriorate further, so I attempted to comprehend the situation. I observed a second door on the far right side of the room. It was diminutive and partially obscured by the scant illumination, yet it was present. Upon opening it, I discovered it led to a staircase that ascended to the cellar door outside the house. I felt quite foolish for not having the foresight to investigate the cellar door upon our arrival, as I had merely assumed it led to the basement. Throughout our entire residence here, I had never even opened it, leaving me in a state of bewilderment regarding the entire matter. The situation rapidly escalated into terror. Someone had been residing in my home for an indeterminate duration. Various peculiar occurrences began to coalesce in my mind. Since relocating, my wife and I have observed several inexplicable anomalies, primarily items going missing. Until that moment, I had attributed these incidents to my wife's propensity for misplacing belongings. However, this revelation altered everything. An intruder had been inhabiting our residence. I had to mentally reiterate this notion numerous times before I could fully comprehend its implications. Uncertain about the situation, I was unaware of who had been present or their motives, yet I was resolute in my desire to prevent their return. I attempted to contact the former owners, seeking an explanation and even contemplating legal threats, but they either did not answer or had disconnected their number, seemingly unwilling to engage. Both Sarah and I were unnerved. That night, I utilized substantial furniture to barricade the cellar door from within, securing it with a robust chain and padlock for added precaution. I was determined to take any necessary measures, was determined to prevent anyone from entering through that door unnoticed. The police arrived, documented a comprehensive report, and assured us they would attempt to reach the previous owners. We also contacted our realtor, who was appalled and offered to support the police in any capacity. That night, as we prepared for bed, we heard a resounding thud at the front door. Lola sprang up, barking frantically, and we both remained motionless, exchanging glances while listening intently. After several minutes, although the banging ceased, we then heard small rocks striking our bedroom window. Sarah clutched Lola while I approached the window. Despite Sarah's pleas for me to refrain, my anger compelled me to confront whoever was outside. I retrieved the baseball bat from beneath the bed and pulled the curtains aside, yet visibility was obscured. We believed the disturbance had ended. Sarah suggested contacting the police, but a part of me was inclined to resolve the situation independently, aware that the police would likely intimidate them into fleeing. Label it as pettiness, yet I was determined to ensure that the perpetrator was apprehended. I informed her that if another incident occurred, I would contact authorities. Shortly thereafter, I heard the sound of glass shattering from downstairs. I rushed down just in time to witness two figures fleeing the premises, with the kitchen window entirely broken. It was at that moment I called the police, who arrived shortly thereafter. They conducted a search of the house and the basement but found no evidence of forced entry into the storm room, nor did they locate anyone on the property. My best hypothesis is that the individual residing in the premises below became enraged upon discovering their eviction and opted to return to instill fear in us. I was simultaneously infuriated and appalled. My wife has been in a state of distress ever since the police intensified the situation, given that a legitimate crime occurred. They indicated they are attempting to locate the former occupants, but this process may require several days. That was 2 full days ago, and we have yet to establish communication with them. I believe the police have temporarily deterred those intruders, at least for the time being. They have not returned to our residence, and I am genuinely astonished that such a situation could arise. If we are unable to establish communication with the former owners promptly, I am at a loss regarding my next steps. I am entirely prepared to defend myself, although I hope it does not escalate to that point. When I purchased my first home at the age of 27, after years of diligent saving, I took pride in my modest acquisition. However, transitioning to independent living required significant adjustment, having resided with my parents throughout my life alongside 3 siblings. With siblings and 2 dogs, the house was perpetually loud and vibrant. However, this environment was starkly quiet, eerily quiet. This absence of noise constituted the most challenging aspect of the transition. Living alone felt peculiar, and initially, I doubted my ability to acclimate. Anyone who has transitioned from cohabiting with family to solitary living can relate to this experience. One feature I cherished about the house was the diminutive balcony on the 2nd floor. To clarify, I hesitate to label it a balcony, as it was scarcely large enough to. I could not even accommodate a chair on the balcony. Nonetheless, I frequently ventured out there after work to unwind and gather my thoughts. I smoked quite regularly, yet I detested the odor, rendering indoor smoking unfeasible. The balcony proved to be doubly advantageous for this reason, as I could smoke without stepping outside or departing from the comfort of my home, which felt like a luxury. To provide context, I will describe the property layout. The block I resided on was typical, featuring houses in close proximity to one another. The street behind my house mirrored mine, implying that all the residences would share a backyard were it not for the 10-foot-tall fences delineating the property boundaries. From my balcony, I could observe my backyard neighbor's yard, which was entirely visible. After a few weeks, I recognized that I had encountered nearly all the neighbors except him. Upon reflection, I realized I had never seen him, much less engaged in conversation with him. He never acknowledged me with a wave and was never present in his yard or from my vantage point by the window, it appeared as though he was non-existent. the sporadic illumination from his bedroom at night was the sole indication of occupancy. I surmised that an elderly individual resided there, as the overgrown grass suggested neglect, and I never perceived any sounds emanating from the yard. After a week of mounting curiosity, I resolved to introduce myself and associate a visage with the name. One Saturday, I circumnavigated the block to his residence, anticipating a brief exchange upon knocking on the door. The house appeared dilapidated. Rough was a gross understatement. It seemed entirely neglected, with the yard overrun by weeds and the entire property looking as though it had been disregarded for years. The paint was peeling, some siding had been scraped away, and the walkway was discolored. The doorbell was inoperative, prompting me to deliver several forceful knocks and await a response. Silence ensued, leaving me feeling awkward and contemplating whether the residence was indeed unoccupied. However, I then noticed a subtle movement behind the window shade, a brief flicker suggesting someone was observing. I realized someone was inside, observing me, yet they refused to open the door. As I turned to depart, the door abruptly swung open, crashing against the wall as if forcefully torn apart in a fit of fury. Startled, I recoiled and found myself confronting an elderly Asian woman in the doorway, who was gazing intently at me. She was diminutive, with gray hair secured in a tight bun, and her skin was wrinkled yet somehow taut, as if she were flexing her facial muscles. Her eyes were unervingly wide, and I cannot deny that I was quite unsettled by her gaze. There was an inexplicable quality about her, as if she were under the influence of something. She remained silent, staring blankly at me. After a moment, I cleared my throat and introduced myself as her new neighbor. She eventually responded with her name, Margaret, accompanied by a half-smile, but she did not inquire about my name. She continued to observe me in silence. I nodded and turned away, at a loss for words, and departed. Feeling more unsettled than I wished to acknowledge, I did not hear the door close behind me, yet I refrained from turning around to avoid being caught. Later that evening, I ventured onto my balcony as usual, attempting to dismiss the peculiar encounter. At that moment, I was unaware of the predicament I had unwittingly entered. When I peered over the railing, there she was, the eccentric woman from earlier, standing motionless in her yard, gazing directly at my house. She neither moved nor called out. She simply stood there, staring, and those instances of uncertainty regarding one's perception. I was unsure whether to acknowledge her presence, gesture, or feign ignorance. It was among the most unsettling experiences I had encountered, leaving me at a loss for how to respond. I retreated indoors, rationalizing that she was merely eccentric and that I should not be overly concerned about an innocuous elderly woman. However, the situation escalated. The subsequent night, I observed her again, this time transitioning between windows within her residence. She observed me from each location, although I feigned ignorance. A part of me sensed that she was aware of my awareness. I wished for her to cease, yet she continued to gaze at me. Upon concluding my smoking, I turned to enter the house. Out of curiosity, I glanced through one of my windows approximately 20 minutes later to ascertain whether she was still watching my residence. To my dismay, she indeed was. I contacted my father, who suggested that she might be suffering from dementia or a similar condition and that she was likely just lonely or disoriented. She advised me to feel sympathy for her, yet it was challenging to empathize with someone who exhibited borderline stalking behavior. However, my father reassured me, asserting that she was innocuous. Several nights elapsed without any peculiar incidents. I did not observe her in her yard or at her windows. I began to believe my father's assessment and felt relieved that I had refrained from taking drastic measures. This perception persisted until one morning when I discovered a woman's sock on my side of the fence, lying in my yard. I gazed at it in disbelief. A chill coursed through me. Her peculiar behavior had escalated. She had trespassed on my property, leaving me uncertain about how to proceed. I was reluctant to confront her, yet I felt increasingly compelled to address the situation. I should have contacted the authorities immediately, but I hesitated, wishing to avoid conflict with a neighbor. That night, as I lay in bed, the doorbell rang incessantly, no fewer than a dozen times, in rapid succession. I didn't need to check. I was certain it was her. In my fatigue, my thoughts were muddled. Clearly, I was more irritated than frightened. I rose, donned a shirt, and approached the door, reminding myself that I had previously requested she leave me alone. I acknowledged that I had procrastinated long enough, and it was time to confront the issue. I cannot comprehend why I felt no fear in that moment. I still reflect with embarrassment on how nonchalantly I managed the situation. I hesitate to label myself as naive, yet I cannot find a more fitting term to encapsulate my demeanor. The instant I opened the door, she lunged at me, charging towards me at full speed. With a kitchen knife in her hand and her face contorted in rage, she began to scream, accusing me of having taken her son. I had little time to comprehend the situation before I seized her arm, successfully wresting the knife from her grip and pinning her to the floor. Although she was relatively easy to overpower, the circumstances remained profoundly frightening. My heart raced, and my hands trembled as I restrained her and called the police. She continued to scream incoherently about her son, threatening to kill me. At one point, she attempted to bite me, but I refused to release her until the police arrived. Those 5 minutes felt interminable. She incessantly screamed and writhed throughout. When the police finally arrived, they restrained her and compelled her into one of their cruisers. Her screams persisted even after she was confined in the vehicle. I had never experienced such fear in my life. The police ensured my well-being and informed me that she would be transferred to a psychiatric facility. I never encountered her again. This occurrence continues to burden my thoughts and has undoubtedly rendered me more anxious and cautious. I subsequently relocated less than a year later.